Let's get on with it.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, I note that the Prime Minister has this afternoon apologised to Kim.com for the basic areas of his agency. Mr Speaker, what he has not apologised for is what is really the core of this debate, and that is his slackness in his oversight of that agency. Mr Speaker, I'd like to give, I think, many members of the House a little bit of a history lesson, going back to 1977, where I had one of my 1977, when I had a notable appearance in this House, and was in fact arrested during the SIS Amendment Bill. Mr Speaker, the reason that I was arrested then was that I believed that there was too much power being centralised in the hands of one person, at that stage Sir Robert Muldoon, and I didn't believe that there were systems around them. I didn't believe that there were systems around them to ensure that there was proper supervision of the Prime Minister. Since that time, there have been some changes that have made that have improved the legislation slightly, but more importantly, ever since that time, there have been Prime Ministers that have treated their role in this area diligently. They have worked diligently, they have been briefed, they have read their papers, they have asked the questions that needed to be asked. Mr Speaker, I can remember one occasion when I was with Helen Clark in her car early in her Prime Ministerial time, and both the driver and I got booted out of her car. She borrowed my phone because I had a Vodafone and she only had a Telecom, so that that was properly secure, so that she could get properly briefed on an urgent matter. It was so important that she didn't want to wait for half an hour to get to a secure landline. She wanted to do that. Now, the question I've got is, does this Prime Minister interest himself at all in the work of his security agencies, or is he prepared to say, OK, boys, just go and do what you want? OK, boys, just go and do what you want, because it's sort of, I'm not going to ask, because if I ask, I might know. And if I know that you're doing something wrong, I'll be in even worse trouble. And that's what the situation is here. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister was not prepared to apologise to this House for what he knew happened. He was not prepared to go into the detail in the Parliament, the place where he is meant to be held accountable. He runs away, Mr Speaker. He does not front up. He does not front up in this House and apologise for the fact that he is not doing his job properly. Mr Speaker, he is meant to uphold ministerial standards. That is his job. He is the Prime Minister. He is meant to be above all others. And Mr Speaker, in this case, his plea of ignorance is just not good enough. Ignorance is not an excuse when you are the Prime Minister who is meant to be supervising an agency where the relationship is much closer and the supervision necessarily much closer than, for example, with the police or any other government agency. This stuff very rarely gets anywhere near a court. There is very rarely a check or a balance on the power of the Prime Minister and these agencies. And that is what he is. He is the point where our entire democracy depends on his agency doing its job properly, and for that to happen, the Prime Minister must supervise it. And to say he can't know anything about the operations is just horseshit, Mr. Speaker. It is just absolute nonsense. The Prime Minister must know about the areas where there are operations going on, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has to know that there are matters that he should be looking at. Mr. Speaker, we have given this Prime Minister a lot of support in this area. There is an enormous amount of trust goes to every... I agree with that member there. The Prime Minister should be better than that. I agree with that member. Every other Prime Minister, going right back in my entire time in Parliament, has been better than that. And which member's that? Which one is it?
I'm not sure.
The one with glasses next to... No. What? Scott? It was Scott Simpson, I'm told. Scott Simpson says we deserve better than that, and I totally agree with him. We deserve a Prime Minister that reads his documents, a Prime Minister that gets briefed. And what we have seen here is a debacle and an absolute failure of a Prime Minister to run a spy agency with integrity. It is his job to run it with integrity. It is his job to look carefully at what they are doing, because he is a democratic check on the system. And when he doesn't do his job properly, as he clearly has not done now, then the democratic check that should be there is absent. They run amok, they break the law, they spy on people that they're not meant to be spying on. Mr. Speaker, there's another question. There's another question that needs to be asked. We know that the information has been flowing. We know the assistance has been flowing to the United States. Is it correct that US agencies were also involved in covert surveillance within New Zealand with the full knowledge of the Prime Minister's agency? Did a foreign agency act contrary to New Zealand law? Did a foreign agency act contrary to New Zealand law with the connivance of an agency for which the Prime Minister is responsible? If that is the case, then I expect that any Prime Minister with integrity will be in a position where they cannot survive. Because, Mr. Speaker, it is the role of the Prime Minister to make sure that these boys' own tricks do not occur. It is his job to make sure that the spies do not run amok. They have an enormous amount of power, and if the suggestion is that overseas agencies, as well as our own GCSB, if overseas agencies acting covertly in New Zealand with the connivance, with the assistance, with the knowledge of our security agencies, if that was occurring, then that is even worse than what has occurred here. The other question, which we still haven't heard any confirmation of, is whether in fact, as was alleged in the Dominion Post this morning, the immigration file for Kim.com was in fact given to the police before the raid, well before the raid, by the Immigration Service. It's a pretty basic question. Was it given or wasn't it given? And if it was given, Immigration Service says that it was. What we want to know is, did anyone bother reading it? Did anyone bother reading the file that was supplied? Did Maurice Williams... Maurice is here. Maurice knows a bit about land information and that sort of area. Jonathan Coleman knows a bit about that area. Simon Power knows a bit about that area. Well, I just tell you what used to happen in the old government. If two ministers disagreed and one overruled the other, then you made a file note and the Prime Minister had a look. When you had a difference, you had a minister overruling another minister, you had something which was important to government, you wrote it down, Maurice Williamson's nodding, and you know what I think happened? I think the Prime Minister didn't read it. I think the Prime Minister didn't read. Well, he didn't read the police report.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable
Willfully.
member. His time has expired.
Thank you.
I call Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.